Today is March the 29th, 2006. Today we're going to interview Paul Mills for the Mooresville Museum. And Paul, we certainly thank you for letting us do this. Paul is as I say, we're here at the Presbyterian Church doing this interview. Paul and his wife Jean live in Mooresville on Heritage Place. Paul, let's get started this way.
Okay.
When I talked to you yesterday to find out if we had all of the ends tied up and were ready to go today, you mentioned that you were looking at some of your family history and you were aware of where they came from, how they got to Mooresville. How about picking up on that and telling us some of that history?
Well, I was looking, I believe it's my great-great-great-great-grandfather was a merchant in England, and then he came to America, and he had 6 or 8 sons, and they first came to Maryland, in Mills Point, Maryland. I don't know, I've never been there, so I don't know anything about it, but they've got a lot of names of the mills in that area, and it's in that book, but I can't remember it. But during the Revolution, one of his sons was talking about the country down here between the Yadkin and the Catawba River, and he said it's rich, fertile land with plenty of game, and he said he wouldn't mind coming down here. And his brother, I believe his name is John Nathaniel Mills, decided he would come. So he got married and came down here, and they had a tract of land over off Shinville Road, 600-acre grant, but near Shinville Road and Withers Creek, and he had a big house over there, and the church, after some dissatisfaction with meeting in Troutman, decided to meet in his house. So they were meeting in his house, and he had what they call the great room in the middle of the house, and they had 15 people who attended that church, and it's what's today is known as St. James Episcopal Church, and it's around the corner. And when the family started multiplying and some of them dying, they started a cemetery. He put his granddaughter, she was the first one to be buried in that old Mill Cemetery around the corner on Withers Creek Road. And after that, the others were, and the whole family, I think, is in that cemetery. But you can't even read the tombstones. And that's on my, and that is my forefathers. And on my grandmother's side, she was a Brawley, and she was raised in the shepherd community. And but there's several generations in between. But that's where I come from. That's my roots.
Okay, now let's come forward.
Incidentally, my grandmother was she is Scotch-Irish, though. I remember her talking about hollyhocks from Ireland, and there's these flowers that they had, and we lived with my grandmother a lot, and I think I was one of her favorites. I used to sleep with her. She had a big soft bed, feather bed, and she slept in the only warm room in that house when we lived with her. It had a fireplace, and it's funny that they had these quilting things. They're on pulleys, and it raised the quilt up at night, and you look up at night and you see the quilts. Then in the morning they let them down, and then the women get around and do their quilting, in the warm room. But that was the room she slept in. But she was a devout Methodist. She wanted the preachers at the church when they would have a revival down at Broad Street Methodist Church. She would always want the preachers to stay at her house, and she would let them have the front bedroom.
Paul, let's come forward a few years and tell us when you were born, where you were born, where you lived as a youngster.
Okay, I was born in Lawrence Hospital Now, not many were born in hospitals. See, Lawrence Hospital, and looking at that book, was built in 1925. Mr. Lawrence got real sick, and he talked to one of the doctors about starting a hospital, and he donated the land to Lawrence Hospital. That's why it's over there in what we used to call Eastern Heights. And I was born there. Now, Jean was not. She was born in Cornelius. And there was no hospital in Cornelius, Mecklenburg County.
Where did you live at that time?
Well, I've lived in a lot of houses in Mooresville. I've lived in probably 6 or 8 different houses. Primarily, we lived at our grandmother's house at 212 East Wilson Avenue. It was an unpaved street there. It's the house beside of Mr. Edmonston. It was on an acre lot, and I remember she used to have a cow on that street. We raised chickens there, I know, because we would order the baby chicks and keep them heated under an electric light bulb. And we didn't have a washer and a dryer. We had an iron pot out in the backyard, and you'd have to build a fire under it. And you didn't have soap like we have today. They used to use Octagon soap, and they would slice it. I remember that. They'd slice the soap. They didn't have the dust, like you have now, like the powder. We killed our chickens out there too. Wring their necks in the backyard.
Now, Paul, you said that your mother and dad worked in the mill.
Yeah, they worked for. It was the Mooresville Cotton Mills then. It was a cotton mill. The Mooresville Mills is. I've worked in there too before I was drafted, but Mooresville is the only mill around here where you could bring in raw cotton in bales and turn that cotton into roving, and then into yarn, then into thread, and they had the warps that the looms would be on, and they could take the raw cotton and turn it into a product and send it to the dye house, and they would dye the fabrics or dye the thread, and it would come out as a finished product, packaged and ready for market. They even had a packing room. And so it's the only mill around, and it employed thousands of people at one time, and worked 3 shifts, especially during the war. World War II I'm talking about.
Okay, now say something about the houses that you lived in. Were they owned by the mill?
Yes. Now, grandmother owned her own house. They built it for $500. It had 2 bedrooms, and when we moved in it, Dad added 2 more rooms to it. And the bathrooms in many of those houses were attached to the back because they did not have room for a bath in them. They did not have hot water. Your stoves, your wood stoves, had warmers on the side to heat the water. They had warmers on top to keep the food warm, and they had eyelets, that you and stove wood. When I was a boy, I remember getting up and building a fire in the kitchen because that's where everybody would go. You'd have to cut your wood, and I even had, Dad gave me an axe one time that wasn't too heavy for when I was a little boy to split wood with. That was my Christmas present. Had my own axe. But now we had a bathtub, but many of those houses did not have bathtubs. And they were inexpensive. They were just plain houses. That's why it's amazing, because today those houses sell for $50, $60, $70,000. Back then, they cost probably $200 to $500 to build them. But the mill company, when they got out of the housing business, I think they sold them for about $4,000. But the people living in them couldn't afford them, and some people bought them for investments, then rent them back. But the rent to a mill person is 25 cents a room. If you had a 4-room house, you paid $1 a week rent. It was taken out of your check. And that included your water. You had to pay your power bill. But all the power you had was one light coming down from the middle of the room that you put a light bulb in and turn it on. Or if you buy a double socket to have a pull chain, you could pull it over to your bed and reach up and pull the string. We improvised. And we got along. But they did not have bathtubs. Some of those mill houses below the mill, they were not the flush kind. They had a tank behind them. And then the toilet seat, but that's what it is, the language. But it stayed up, and when you sat down on it, it flushed water in it, and when you got up, it automatically flushed. But that's how it worked. And no hot water. It's just everything was cold. If you wanted hot water, you had to heat it on the stove.
Paul, I guess that was kind of referred to as the Mill Hill.
Yes, now they call it the Mill Village. Mm-hmm. We lived down on that side one time, and I had relatives that lived there, and some of them lived down behind the ballpark on the other side of the railroad track. See, the ballpark down there was the Mooresville Mill ballpark. It had bleachers in it, and the covered bleachers and everything. And they had their own team called the Mooresville Moors. And I think Hoyt Wilhelm came from that league. I wasn't a real baseball fan.
He used to play for me.
We played some sandlot games, mainly up at the... We didn't have a place to play except after the mill company bought the first community house in town there. When Dr. Taylor moved, he lived on the corner of South Main, Wilson Avenue, and Church. He owned all that land except one little triangle on the corner where that store was, Dosha Revis's store. And there was a barber shop there and something else. But he owned all that land. And now they've got trailers there, and they've got a service station on the front. It's beside of Holmes's now, and there's a motel there. See, Dr. Taylor owned all that, and he sold it to the mill company. And we had a ball field there where that trailer park is. And we had a tennis court up there where that service station is with 2 tennis courts. And we had the community house, which was the house Dr. Taylor had as his residence. It had a big porch and a detached garage, and we had ping pong. But the mill company, they owned it, and at Christmas, that's where the people would meet for the Christmas party, and the mill would give out a big bag full of fruits, nuts, candies, and all that kind of stuff. That was the employees' Christmas,
Did you have a garden?
Oh, we had a garden when we lived on. Some of these mill houses don't have enough room for a garden. If you look at the lots, you'll see that they don't. And some people may have had one. If they did, I think some of them down on below the mill on the down off Brawley Street and down that area, there was a place down there they could. There was a big pasture there, and I think some of them could have some vegetables. But we could have vegetables, and we had fruit. My grandmother had a damson tree, but we had enough room to have that.
What about, did you have any livestock, any chickens, or like I've heard some
Oh,
places
yeah,
have pigs?
at grandmother's house we did. We had some chickens. We would buy chickens, and especially around Easter time. You could buy colored chickens then. They don't dye them anymore, do they? Mm-hmm. They would be purple and pink and blue. Get your own color.
Paul, you had several, I think, brothers or sisters, and the houses, the mill houses, I guess, were kind of small. Were you crowded, or how did you get along?
Of course, the bedrooms, they were big bedrooms. The bedrooms was as wide as from this table to that wall, and from me to here, and you could get 2 or 3 beds in those rooms and still have room to walk. They didn't have closets. There was no closets. You'd hang what clothes you had on the bedpost or on the back of the door, or if they had a vacant corner, they'd stretch a string across it and put a hanger rod in there, and then cover the front with a curtain, you know, and I mean, they just opened the curtain, the clothes are hanging there. When you got more clothes. I remember
somebody told me to be sure to ask you to tell us about your room in your mill house.
my granddaughter, she the one that lives in Columbia, South Carolina, she's a teacher, and she wrote me, and she's in a special school down there. It's called the School of Inquiry. It's a great school, and she was a teacher at that school. That's the reason she went there, and her children went there. But it just goes to the 5th grade. But she wrote and asked me to tell about the toys, my toys when I was little, and where I slept in my bedroom, my favorite book, and all this kind of stuff. I wrote her back and I said, honey, I didn't have a bedroom. I shared a bedroom with anywhere from 3 to 5 people, you know. But you can put, my aunt lived up the street from us, and she had a 2-bedroom house, and she had 10 children. I mean, and you go look in some of these places today, and you see 8 or 10 Mexicans living in these average houses, and so, but we did have a place to sleep, and we had a bed, but we did not, and it was an unheated bedroom too, and it was an uncool bedroom except the windows, and you could feel the air coming in some of the windows, you know, in the winter. You didn't mind in the summer because they weren't built, they were not insulated, you know. They were not underpinned. We played under the houses. That's where we played on rainy days, is under the houses. You didn't have any snakes under there, see it? It's all open. But the houses were, like I said, they were 25 cents a room, but you didn't have any amenities, any comforts. You just had a place to live. It's like, it's a little bit, it's better than third world countries today.
When you were young, what were the activities that you had? You had some school, you had chores, what did you do for enjoyment? What was your day like?
We made up our own games a lot of times. We would pick up anything we could. We'd pick up wheels, you know, and old wagons, and we would make little cars that are set like soapbox derby cars. We'd make them out of orange crates and 2x4s, and we'd put a wheel on it. We'd put a spring on one side and put a rope on the other, and you'd always pull to the right unless you'd hold it, see, and then you could keep it straight and turn it the other way. We made cars all the time, and we'd go to a hill, and push it up a hill, and then ride down it, and hope we didn't wind up in a creek, you know. But and we would make our own kites. We'd go get sticks, broomsticks, and make a kite. We'd use newspapers and flour paste and make kites. And we would play some ball, something called two-eyed cat ball. You could play it in the street and have 2 batters. And we would play hide and seek, you know, and we'd build tents out of tow sacks, you know, feed sacks. And of course, if it rained, it'd rain right through them. And we played in the woods, played cowboys and Indians, and we'd make our own pistols, you know. We'd find a stick that's shaped like a gun, you know, and cut it and shape it. And we'd make slingshots. We'd get pronged limbs, good limbs, and we'd use an old inner tube to cut up and use shoe. We'd cut the old shoes that were worn out. We'd cut the tongue out of it and use that to put the stone in, and go bird hunting. Go, you know, take potatoes to the woods and start a fire and roast them. I mean, we've had plenty to do. I mean, we never wanted summer to end.
So like you never, it was one of these things that you found your own enjoyment.
Oh yeah, we didn't have organized sports. The only thing that you'd get a gang together and go play some ball or something. But that's and we didn't have many toys at Christmas. We had to share them all. If you had a wagon, you know, it was a wagon for 2 or 3 of you. It wasn't a wagon apiece. Had one bicycle for 5 or something, you know.
When you first got into the workforce, when you started working, how old were you? Imagine you were pretty young. And what did you do?
First jobs I ever had was working in a grocery store for 75 cents a day at Billy Moore's grocery store down on College Street. There's a little local jot 'em down grocery store, you know, where people would buy on credit and go to work at 7 o'clock and work till he closed. But that that was the first job, and I'd have carried newspapers, and I'd just do anything to make money. I'd make more money cutting Miss Billy Moore's yard than I would working all day in the grocery store. She'd give me $1 to cut her yard, and she furnished the push mower. But she didn't have that much grass. People didn't have grass down there. Most of the lots were sandy,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and dirt.
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't. Most of them didn't even own a lawnmower.
Mm-hmm. When you worked at the grocery store, what did you do for the store? Did you sweep? Did you
We
deliver
just
groceries?
sweep and pack stuff and carry stuff to the cars and do whatever they tell you to.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the people would have to walk, you know. Very few people had a telephone then. You'd have to go use someone's. We'd go say, could I borrow your phone? Instead of borrowing it. I mean, I don't know how you'd pay it back, but may I use your phone? Very few people had phone. As you can see from some of these old papers I've got, the phone numbers are like, the operator give me number 16, or operator give me 99, or operator give me number 6, you know. I mean, you could get less than 200 phones in the whole town, I think, you know. And you know where the phone building is, don't you? It's right there on, it was upstairs over what's now an antique shop there on the corner of west side of Johnson's Hardware. Yeah, it was upstairs there. That's where the phone come. And the fire station was over right next door here. You've seen pictures of that. It was right here next to that furniture store, but it's an auto parts place now. But that was the fire station.
South Broad Street.
Mm-hmm. And I used to pick the papers up at the fire station.
When did they have just one newspaper? Or did they have a couple of
The only
newspapers?
one they had, I think they had the Leader or the Rounder before they got the Tribune. Now I have two big thick books of old Mooresville Tribunes. My son, he's like I am. He picks up things. He was working for the Mooresville Tribune when he was in school, high school, and they were throwing out these old papers, you know, just one after the other. They're that thick, of old, back in the 40s, 30s, and 40s.
Paul, let me back up and ask a question that relates to something you said. The job that you had, the grocery store, you used the term "jot 'em down." Tell us what you mean by that for people who may not be familiar with that.
A lot of working people didn't have. They would go buy things on credit, because most people were honest. I mean, we didn't lock doors. We didn't worry about things disappearing. Nobody had much worth stealing anyway. But and back then, most of them were honest. They were known by their honesty, and they would go to a store and say, "Uncle Billy, I don't have any money. Could I buy this on credit?" And he said, "Sure." He said, "I'll pay you when I get paid on Friday." And he would pick up a few things, and then he would come back and he would pay that. Then he'd buy something else and have to come back the next week. It would, you know, it's like an never-ending credit. You know, I mean, it's a week behind. It's instead of going to like you can go to these cash advance stores now and get money, but there was no interest. I mean, they just got whatever the price was, and he'd write it down on a book, and the book had a carbon on the first part, and then he would tear off the underneath and give him the copy. And he would go and he'd have these books stacked up in a rack, just like a letterbox, you know, and of different customers who would come every week and charge stuff. I mean, that wasn't unusual at all in grocery stores. And they would, some of them they could phone in, and once some of the uptown grocers had delivery trucks, and they would deliver the groceries. And you'd call them, tell them what you wanted, they'd pick them out. And they do that now at Harris Teeter. You can call in, tell them what you want, and they've got a personal shopper that they will shop for you, and they'll get what you want, and they select the best. Back then, just anybody in the store would pick it up. They'd pick up the next item, and so the stuff wasn't dated anyway. And crackers were loose. You buy crackers out of a barrel, and chickens, you'd buy live chickens. You'd go pick out your own chicken. They'd put them in what we call a poke then, but it's a paper sack, and they'd tear out the corner and put the chicken's head outside, tie his feet and put his head outside. Do you remember that, Al? Seeing somebody walk down the street with a chicken carrying a chicken in a bag and the head hanging out?
I remember them carrying them in the bags, yeah. Live chickens. Paul, let me ask you another question that relates to the meal and the terminology Mill Hill. Was there ever any, I'll use the word discrimination, to people from the Mill area as opposed to the rest of the, I'll say the rest of the people in town?
Well, there's a difference of downtown people and uptown people, but that's the difference.
Okay.
Most of the people that lived uptown, they had to own their own homes or they rented. But we're downtown, they all worked in the mill. And it was, there is the term Mill Hill, if you've read Bill Brown's book on the track, across the tracks. Well, but they were just good working people, and they did live down there, and we had to walk to school. For if you lived down there, you had to walk to school. I mean, it would be, Mooresville was back then was a mile from the center of the town to the end, and a mile this way, north, south, east, and west, and that was the city limits. And we didn't have, and some people down there though, if the mothers worked, they had enough money that they could pay a taxi, and a taxi would have a route just like a school bus, and he would go down for $1 a week or whatever and pick up your child, and he would take that child to school, and he would be there waiting for that child to take them home. And that way, but he would fill that taxi full of kids. I mean, there might be 8 children in there. I mean, we didn't have seat belts, but the people that wanted their children not to walk, but the walking didn't hurt. It kept them thin. They didn't get fat. You didn't see any pudgy kids.
Where did you go to school?
I went to South School for 6 years. Then in the 7th grade was over in the old Central High School. It was in a wing of the Central High School. It may have been in the basement. I don't remember. But and the grades were 7 through 11 over there. Then next year they changed it to 12. I graduated in 1944. We have quite a few people still living around here that graduate with me, and we had class reunion. We had one the 20th year, and every 5 years up until about 50 years.
Let me ask you one more question that relates to the mill. At that time, when did the mill start those Labor Day picnics that were held back off of what's that
Academy?
Street?
Between Academy
Lawrence. Back in there.
Yeah, Lawrence and Academy. They own the bowling alley down there. See, the bowling alley is there where the Adelphia Television is now, and that was a bowling alley down there. But they also they had them there, but they had them they had picnics at the community house, because the mill owned the community house. And that's where they had Christmas and picnics. I've got a picture of some of the picnics, but I don't remember. I never went to one over there. It was after I was out of the mill, and I worked in the mill from the time I completed the 11th grade. I worked that summer, and then I continued to work in it while I was in the 12th grade. I worked the second shift, so I'd go to school till 2:30, and then I'd go to work at 3 o'clock and work till 11. My senior year in high school, and I worked in there then until I was drafted, because I'd already gotten my draft notification. And that's where all of the high school graduates were going in, if they were physically, unless they had some kind of impairment, were being drafted if they weren't joining. But they wouldn't let you join after you were 18. I tried to get in the Navy when I was 17, just before my 18th birthday, but I had yellow jaundice, and they wouldn't take me. They told me to come back in 6 weeks. And I said, I'll be 18 6 weeks. And I went to draft board, and they said, no, you can't join the Navy. We need you for our quota. So they had quotas. But back to the mill. It was a good place to work. I mean, there's nothing wrong with mill work. It's a little dirty for some people, but it's not as dirty as a mason handling those brick and concrete. I mean, he just makes more money and he's out in the air, whereas you're in a plant. But it was the lifeblood of this town. When the strike was in 1931, I believe it was, people who were on strike, they had to get out of their houses. We had to get out of the house. We lived in a mill house at that time, and we had to move, because if you don't work there, you don't live there. And so we were evicted.
Where did you move to?
And my uncle owned his own house down on College Street. There's certain mill houses, if you go down College Street, you'll see that the mill houses are all on the right, and on the left there until you get to Harris Street. Then there was 2 mill houses. The Frank Moore and Cara Sue Mitchell, they were married. They lived in that one corner house, and the next house was where Tom Swan lives. You know, the Tom Swan VFW, Tom Swan Post. They named the post. He was killed. He was one of the first one killed in World War II. They named a post for him. He lived, and then my aunt and uncle lived in that 2-story house, and we went to live with them. You went to live with relatives? I slept on her living room floor, because there was 8 of us.
That must have been a tough time.
It was, but it was cold, it was winter, and my shoes had holes in them. And my uncle took me to town at Christmas and bought me a pair of shoes at Belk's. You don't forget things like that.
How long did the strike last?
It didn't last very long, because Dad, he moved, that's when we moved to Franklinton. I didn't even know where it was. And my Uncle Floyd, that's Tate's dad, he had 10 children. And we moved, they got jobs in Franklinton, and we moved to Franklinton. And we all lived in one big house in Franklinton, 2 families. There was 8 of us and 12 of them, and I think one of them may have even been married then, and maybe had an in-law in there with us. But we didn't live there long. We didn't want to go to school. We didn't like it, and we stayed out of school till the truant officers came and told us we had to go. And I think Tate and Earlene and my myself were all in the same class. We started to that school, but Dad came back and got a job that Neil had started and got a job. And so we moved back. But when I remember that trip to Franklinton in an old car, I don't remember which car it was, but he was a car buff. He loved cars, and he even had a sidecar motorcycle, you know. But this old car didn't have a heater in it. It just had what they call it's a heater that heats off of the exhaust. Not, you know, and you just got a little on that car. You got a little hole there with something that you move over, and you get a little bit of warm air in there from the engine compartment. And that was in the front seat. We had Quilts in the back seat, but there was 5 of us in the back, you know. But we were hunched together, you know, with Quilt. But it was a long ride. No place to stop.
What kind of job did your dad find in Franklinton?
Beg your pardon?
What type of job did he find in Franklinton?
He is a mill work.
So it was mill
That's
work
what
there
they're
also?
experienced at in weaving. I went to see the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it was interesting to see the loom that they had back then. I don't know if you've been to see it. It's fascinating. There's one segment of the Jewish population that they went down to Qumran, I think it is. That's down near the Dead Sea, and they made their own. They had 2 sticks, and they had the thread across this way, just with something hanging it down, and then they would take the string and on a ball of string, and they'd put it through, you know, weave it by hand and push it up. But it was interesting to see. Another thing was interesting. It showed the leather work that they had, and they had this little wide comb, and this comb had real thick, wide teeth on one end. They said that's for combing the hair, because you listen to it as you go to this and you push a number and you listen to it, and said the other side is for combing lice. Said everybody had lice because they did not cut their hair. The Jewish people did not cut their hair like the Egyptians did. You see all of them, they were bald-headed, you know. But the Jewish people would have long hair. And said everybody had lice, even from the poorest to the kings. They would take that, and on one side it was real fine, you know, and you'd comb it to get those nits out. That lice is still around.
After you came back to the mill, your dad came back, then you finished high school here,
Yes.
and then
I went into the Army.
you went into the Army.
Okay.
And how long were you in the Army?
I was in the Army a year and a half. See, I went in 45, and the war was over 3 months after I went in. I was in basic infantry training at the time, but I took typing and bookkeeping in high school because I wanted to do something else. And they saw that I had typing, and they needed, because then when the war was over, VE Day in Europe, they needed separation centers, because they had some men over there. See, those men had been over there 3-4 years away from home. Now they rotate them every 3 months or 6 months or something, you know. But and some of them had families, and they drafted people up to age 38. 38's pretty old but now to go in, if you've been in the military, it's fine, but to take you in at 38, they do, and so they were letting them out based on their battles, based on their time of service, and based on their family responsibilities at home. They were discharging a lot of them from the European theater. The group that I was with was sent to Italy. I was trained in Camp Croft, South Carolina. That's south from Spartanburg. It's no longer there. But it's just like Camp Green in Charlotte's no longer there. Morris Field is no longer there. So they sent me to Fort Meade, Maryland. and I stayed there for the duration. And then I came back. Of course, you had the GI Bill, and of course, anybody that had finished high school could go to schools. And I hooked up with a friend of mine, Frank Brown, and Eugene Westmoreland. I don't know if you know Opal. You know Opal.
Yes.
Eugene had died. He was the valedictorian of our class. And we all went to a business school in Charlotte. There was two of them down there, Queens Business School, and the other one was called Carolina Business School, and we went to Carolina Business School. It was on South Tryon Street, and so that's where I went to school. And I got a diploma, certificate in it was a junior accountant and bookkeeping. And so then I went to work for Prudential Insurance Company across the right in the Johnston building, and I stayed there for years, working for Prudential in the office. And then I wanted to get married, and so Prudential transferred me to Newark, and I lived in Newark, New Jersey, and worked in the group department. Lived in South Orange. You could see the skyline of New York from those Orange Mountains. And I stayed there, and they were building another regional office in Jacksonville, Florida. And I was going to move down to Jacksonville. I was going to live in Florida. I didn't want to stay in New Jersey. And so, but my brother-in-law, he's my brother-in-law, he was unhappy. He was working for, I believe he was working for Jefferson Standard. He was a traveling auditor, and he didn't like to travel. And so we bought a service station on the corner of Church and Moorhead Street, right there where the Panther Stadium is. It's concrete now, but it was a Texaco service station. And I was working 6 and 7 days, finally stopped working on Sunday. Wasn't making that great amount of money. And so I knew and I wanted to get married, and so we were planning to be married. I was marrying Frank's sister, Jean. And so we moved to, I got a job with Pilot Life in Sedgefield, which is between Greensboro and High Point. And Jefferson eventually merged with Pilot Life. And we built a house over there, and they were building us a house on Colonial Avenue, 1905. It was a nice little house. I was getting it for about $12,000, 4% loan, and had a garage. And so the house was not ready, but Jean had already, she was secretary to the manager of the Prudential Insurance Company. She had gotten a job there with the Prudential, and so her mother didn't want her to go up there and live separately, so she wanted us to get married. That's why we got married in the parsonage, which so that she wouldn't, because I was living with a lady and walked, and I could, I was living in downtown Greensboro and catch a bus out to Sedgefield, because they would pick us up, take us to Sedgefield. And so we didn't live there but 11 months. So the first person that looked at it. And I said, we were coming home every week. We didn't even go to church over there. I mean, she was so homesick, and so I got a job back in Charlotte selling life insurance, and so we came back here, and she went to work for the manager of Allstate Insurance Company. And we lived in Charlotte. We built a house on Town Country Road there, out in the country. Now, it was just a development being developed there off of Carmel Road by Joe Shoneth's wife, Dorothy Shoneth. And he had a candy company on South Tryon Street, and he had big apartment houses in Miami. And all those streets in Town and Country Estates there is named after streets in Miami. So, and then, I don't know when I've forgotten, but I guess we moved up here. We moved, I moved, that's when we moved to Nashville. We had, the first child was born in Charlotte. And then I got this promotion to being general agent in Nashville, Tennessee for Lincoln National. I had changed companies to Lincoln National. And so we moved to Nashville. We lived in Nashville about 7 years. Had 3 children there. It was a good town.
And then when did you get back to Mooresville?
Well, that was 1967. We moved to Charlotte and lived 3 more years in Charlotte. We lived off Providence Road on Town and Country Road. And our daughter was in the 5th grade, and they were busing her to downtown Charlotte, to First Ward. It's not the First Ward you know today. And there wasn't a single child that she knew in her class or that school that was going down there, because they were starting private schools. And she went. We tried it. And a group of people in Providence Baptist Church in that area there wanted to start a school, and they bought a house and land there on Sharon Road, I believe it is, and started Providence Day School. And it's a big school today, but it was a trailer and a house when it started. And she had an excellent teacher, because when she came here, she had the highest IQ of anybody in the class. But it was integrated here. She went to Woods. It's now that tech school over there, but that was the black school, and Mooresville didn't have any problem with their integration. We didn't object to it. But what happened was that in Charlotte, all the busing, and here, she went, and Mooresville, when they closed that school, they just picked the school they wanted to go to, and see, it was just disseminated. But she liked Dunbar School. It was called Dunbar. It used to be called Dunbar when she was going there. And then, that's how we got back to Mooresville in 1967. But we were coming back home. But quite a few people have done that. And a lot of people who came here with Burlington, and they were going to transfer them again, they quit Burlington to stay in Mooresville. A lot of people I know used to work for Burlington. And when Burlington was going to move them, they stayed. You got Martha West and Dick West. He worked for Burlington.
Do you remember any other, I'll say, interesting stories or whatever about Mooresville in years gone by?
Well, we used to have 3 theaters in downtown Mooresville. Do you know that? The Moore, the Carolina, and the State. And you could go to the Moore for a nickel on Wednesdays. There's a dime on, and it was there where the Marcade is now. That was a theater. And the State, and it was segregated. The State was segregated. They had a balcony, for the colored, black, whatever, or African American. And the State did also. And they had, at the theaters, on Wednesdays, they would have 2 B-grade movies, and a serial. And you'd go back to see that serial. There'd be Flash Gordon or Tom Mix or Buck Jones, something was always exciting happening. That was a lot of the entertainment in Mooresville. And then when you got older, you would go on Saturday nights to the Owl Show. That's where they would close the theater about 10 o'clock. Then we would reopen it for a different feature for the adults. It was not an adult movie, I mean, it was not just a cowboy and Indians movie, you know. But we saw some scary stuff on those movies, but I think they're silly now. But the theater was, and you could get a quarter, have a quarter, and on Saturday you could go and pay a dime to get in and buy a bag of popcorn and a drink from the snack shop next door. John Archer had the snack shop next door. Or you could stop at the drugstore and buy a nickel candy bar that was frozen in the freezer where they keep the ice cream. And you could make a day of it, and you could go at about 10, 11 o'clock, and you could stay till dark. Just see the same movies over and over, and then walk home.
Did you go to or did you participate in any of the carnivals or circuses or other live entertainment that came in from out of town?
I don't remember that much coming here. I remember revivals coming here. They'd set up revival tents down there on, it was Annie Ree Walker's property now on South Church Street now. You don't know where it is, but you know where the big White House is on the corner of Wilson Avenue and South Church Street? Diagonally across from the Second Presbyterian Church, which is now an apartment house. They owned that property. You know, that one house that's way off the road, I think some kind of contractor must live there now, see bucket trucks. That was her house. And she evidently would rent that front lot there. It's sort of open there. And a revivalist would set up a tent there and have revival services. I remember one was George Washington Cooper from Hickory. And he was a fire and brimstone preacher. And when he was not there during the day, we would go up there and play in the tent and pretend we were preaching. My grandmother always wanted me to be a preacher, but God didn't call me. So, you know, there's a lot of people out there that their mamas and their grandmothers call them to be preachers, but they're not God called, and they're not as good as they could be.
I remember seeing some pictures of troops coming through Mooresville during the war. Do you remember any of that?
Yes, I remember lots of troop trains coming through with all kinds of equipment on them, tanks and trucks and things like that. I don't remember any of them stopping, you know. They were just passing through, probably going to Winston-Salem or somewhere points north. I did not know, you know, back then people were patriotic, you know, and says loose lips sink ships, you know. People are not patriotic today. They just criticize. I can't stand it. I really can't. Now, my dad was a Democrat, and he used to drive his car for $5 on election day and pick up people he knew to go vote. And, of course, everybody was a Democrat then. If you weren't a Democrat, you didn't vote because the person was elected in the primary. So, I mean, you had a tough primary, but once that person was elected, I mean, it was a shoo-in. And, but I've changed my politics since then because of the way this country's gone. So I just people would cheer the military, and they were sympathetic to those. Like Tate's family, my uncle had 5 boys in World War II. He had Clyde and Ned and Tate and Mike and Harold. And so we just lived. We were just brought up differently. I think we were more respectful, especially during the war, because we saved dimes. The children would save dimes and put them on a card, and they'd get 3 cards full, and then they'd turn it in for a war bond. And we would collect scrap metal. We would collect bottles. We would collect paper. We would collect anything. And we even would take our toothpaste tubes, you know, and because they were metal back then, we didn't have plastic, and we saved toothpaste tubes, and we saved. And of course, the women couldn't get hosed, and of course the things were rationed. You could not buy. Coffee was limited. And of course, gasoline, if you had an A sticker, you could get 3 gallons a week. And you know how long 3 gallons would last you. Now, if you had a B or a C, if you were a professional, a doctor, or a traveling salesman or something, you could buy more. But you couldn't buy cars, you couldn't buy tires. You'd recap old tires, and they'd blow out on you. And you'd go pay $10 for a tire, and you might not get home on it because they'd recap tires with blemishes in them and weaknesses in them. But and when we would come home on leave, come home on furlough or something, and you want some gas, there were some places in town, if you knew, it's just like bootlegging, if you knew where it is, they could go get a drink of illegal whiskey, you know, White Lightning. But that wasn't something I've ever had any part in, but I mean, we knew people where they could go where there were bootleggers. I mean, guys that had 40-mile Fords that could outrun, and but we knew where we could buy some gasoline. When gasoline was like 25 to 30 cents a gallon, you could buy it for $1. You could go get 5 gallons for $1.
Times have changed.
Huh? Yeah. You get 5 gallons for $5. Yeah, and so, but you would see, and people would have money taken out of their pay to buy. The companies would take out money out of your pay to buy war bonds with, and that's how a lot of them saved money. And a lot of them after the war had enough money to build a house, you know, instead of living in a mill house. And that's when there was a building boom, and when there was, and could they begin to manufacture cars again. My dad, he had bought a 40-mile Ford, see, just before the war, and it was a maroon. Now you might call it burgundy, but we call it maroon. It was a 2-door car. And it was a running car, V8. And during the war, the police department had one car here in Mooresville. It was an old blue 41 Ford. They bought a late model car, but they couldn't get another one, and they wore it out. And the seats in it were just, you sit on them and they would just crush, you know, because all they did was haul trunks in it, you know. I mean. And it was a baby blue. And, yeah, 41, if you know 41, that's a blocky thing. Whereas the 40-mile Ford is a classic. It still is. But the 41 is not. And he traded cars with the police department. They came to him and wanted to trade cars with him. And they offered him boot. They offered to pay him some difference. I don't know how much he got. It might have been $100. It might have been $200. But he traded cars with the police department. And that made our whole family so mad because they loved that 40-mile Ford. But he would trade anything. I've known him to have Terraplanes and Hudsons, and he'd have Whippets and Essex, and that picture there is a Maxwell. And he loved cars. I think he traded a car for a cemetery lot where some of my family is buried over here in Willow Valley. they have a 12 plot or 10 plot grave site there that my grandmother and grandfather and some of my uncles and aunts are buried in there. But they're over there in Glenwood. That's where we have plots, and we all have different plots. They're not together, not like a family plot.
The trains that came through Mooresville were a big boom for Mooresville when they started coming through. What do you remember of the trains? Did it have any impact on you?
The trains,
Yes.
did they have any what?
Impact as you were growing up
Oh,
when they
well,
started
they
coming
were
through?
more regular than they are now. I think we got one a day now. But everybody, but see, when they build these highways and everything is transported by truck now, there at the depot, we had a platform behind the depot. That space there had a dock, and they brought cars in by freight. They would put, I think, 4 cars in a freight car, and they would drive them off. And if he ordered one for you, you could see it brought in. And I don't know how they got them out of those doors, but you know they can open them pretty wide. But they pull them out of there, and they'd pull them off there, but you could not get a car. You'd have to put your name in. And people who would butter the dealers, you know, under the table, pay them extra, they'd get a car, you know, and you'd still be on the list, you know. And it was sort of like that when there was shortages of everything, from coffee to hose to cars to building materials. But there was a boom because people had saved money. See, everything went to war effort. You couldn't buy much except just the necessities and only a limited amount. And then they saved money, and they wanted to spend it, and that's what started in the late 40s and hadn't stopped yet. But let's see, what else were you wanting to ask me? I told you a lot of junk.
I think you covered the specific items or things that I wanted to ask you about.
I remember the hotel downtown, you know. We had a hotel with a balcony that looked over the street, and you've seen the picture of the town of Mooresville. Some of those pictures are made and there, and I was looking at in there. I saw one of my first when I worked for Prudential, when I started for $1 an hour for $35 for 35 weeks, and I paid $311 income tax. But when I started in the mill, I was making $0.25 an hour. Then they had the minimum wage to 40 cents, and I made $16 a week when I worked in the mill. And I paid $8 of that for room and board because parents, the children, paid to live at home if they lived at home back then. Now, my brother got married when he worked for Western Union. He made $5 a week. He was the one older than I am. All of them are dead now except my youngest brother. But he married a girl in Statesville, and she didn't tell her mother. Her dad was a postman, and she had never learned anything. You know, she was sort of a privileged girl, and when her mother found out she was married, she put her in the kitchen for 2 weeks, and then she put her on a bus and sent her to Mooresville. And so they stayed with us because he didn't have anything. So when a member of the family would get married, it wasn't unusual for them to come back home. Now, but they didn't stay back home like they do today. Some of them come back and they stay, you know. And but it was family, you know. And we didn't have any what is a soup kitchen. We didn't have a soup kitchen. I mean, people unemployed, people were being evicted from the home, but we didn't have any soup kitchens back then. And some of these people get on welfare and they stay on it. And another thing that I was just crossed my mind is that in downtown Mooresville, everybody went to town on Saturday. All the farmers would come down, everybody else, and walk. The streets were full of people. If you look at those old pictures, cars, and they didn't go out of town to shop. They go to their own town, and some of them had never been out of town. Some of them had never been out of state, but when the World War II came along, and they were dispersed, but it was a different life, but slower, and I have some fond memories of my childhood. I had 5 brothers and 1 sister. With the 5 boys and one girl, 4 brothers, and but the Lord's been good to me. We've been, ever since we've been married, we've gone to church every week, unless we're providentially hindered. We teach 5-year-olds now in First Baptist Church. We taught senior adults until we went to a retirement home. We moved to a retirement home in 2004 at Trinity Oaks, the Lutheran home in Salisbury, and we lived there for 11 months. We didn't sell our house, had no prospects of selling it. We reduced the price 3 times, and they said, well, we're not intending to stay here, so we just gave them notice we were going to move, and we moved. And we moved back here to our home. Had to put all our stuff back in, and I'm giving away a lot of stuff, We only have 1 bed in our house now, and we've got 5 bedrooms. But it's full of stuff, but it's no beds. They come, they have to sleep on sofas or on blow-up beds, But
That's that. Make sure somebody doesn't stay too long.
no, it reminds me of the man. I questioned him about his big family. He had big families come at Christmas, and he said, "Man, do you have the best time?" He said, "Yes, I do." And he says, "So, well, what's the prettiest thing? The best thing? How?" He's saying, "Seeing all those red lights leaving."
Paul, we really appreciate you taking time and coming over and let us interview you. And you've told us a lot of
I sure have.
interesting things. Do you all have anything else you want to ask?
That's all.
Well,
Or if do you have anything else you want to
no,
tell us before we conclude?
No, I'm just no. I do keep things that some of these, like this Noble Mills. He's part of the Mills family here. That I don't connect with them, but and another lady that sent us something about my grandmother. She said my grandmother was a midwife, and Dr. Taylor delivered me. And Dr. Taylor, moved over there in front of the hospital, and Joe Pop lives in his house now. And but my grandmother, she had a very big impact on me growing up. And this lady here wrote the sweetest letter about her and what she did and the things she would do. And she'd go and she'd beat the doctors there, and she'd have the water going, and she'd have everything ready to help him, because she knew what to do. And like I said, she'd let the ministers that visiting sleep in her front bedroom and at Broad Street. But I married a Baptist. We were married by Baptists, and she was more faithful than I was. But we belonged to a church wherever we've been, and we raised our children in a Christian home. I don't drink, and I don't tolerate it, because I had drinking brothers and father, and I've seen a lot of it. And the Lord has blessed us. And 2 of them went to law school. 1 of them married a lawyer. 1 of them went to seminary, and she married a pastor. They have a church in Weaverville. And the other one, she married a guy from Hickory. He was in the FBI, or the Secret Service at the time. But they live in Columbia, and he's in law enforcement. He's an investigator, and she's a teacher. And we have 12 beautiful grandchildren. One of them you can see on TV, Alexandria, when she does her dad's commercial, or her grandfather's commercial.
Yeah. Well, thank you again, Paul. And,
You're welcome. I hope I haven't talked too much.
You've
My
done
family,
well.
my family says I talk too much, but I'm a salesman. I won't keep quiet. I am opinionated, and I have core beliefs, core values that I abide by and try to live by, and want to know where I'm going. I'll be 80 my birthday, and you know that it says that you live 70. I'm living on grace now, so it's more.
Thank you again.
But thank you. I enjoyed it. I hope it's a benefit to someone, or the interest of someone. I did this for the kids at school too. You know, one of them lives in a house up there that rented from me. I owned the Beatty house up there on North Main, and the one next to it, the Smith house, and the one that lived there was a teacher, and her son wanted to interview about Mooresville, and so they've got some of this stuff maybe on what I told him, and but we had a good town back then. I guess it still is, but it's not the same.